Here's the thing about California. One day you're enjoying the surf and the nice weather and the great hikes. That California dream, you know? The following day, oh, an earthquake here, a mega drought there, wildfires getting closer and closer to your neighborhood every year. And climate change, is that you eroding our fabulous beaches? Hey, you horrible scamp, go away. Natural disasters are as much a part of California as overpriced housing and gridlock freeways. So let's talk about it, shall we? I'm Gustavo Arellano. You're listening to The Times, daily news from the LA Times. Today is May 13th, 2021, and Eid Mubarak to y'all. The GOP removes Wyoming Congresswoman Liz Cheney from her House leadership post. Gas shortages hit the Southeast due to a hacked pipeline. And Ellen DeGeneres ends her talk show after 19 years. Now she'll have more time to kick it with W. Today, we're getting together with my LA Times colleagues that cover wildfires, the coast, and of course, earthquakes. You know, everything that humans have to deal with, live with, we really can't control. In this episode, our first installment of our series, Masters of Disasters. Cue the music. Californians experience all sorts of natural disasters. Earthquakes, obviously. Wildfires, check. Active volcanoes, we've got 8. We even got a fire tornado last summer. And climate change is making all these calamities worse. That's why the LA Times has long had our own disaster unit, some of the best reporters in the business. They tell you not just what's happening, but what's coming to the rest of the country one way or another. We're prepared for whatever's coming. Well, sort of. Let's introduce our panel of peril with an introduction. So Ron Lin, we'll start with you. Your Twitter handle says #earthquakes, #coronavirus, and peril.
That's right. Ever since I was a kid, for some reason, I started looking at both earthquakes and anything that could really kill you. And I'm super interested in what can kill you.
One of the best in the business. And sadly, because it's earthquakes, Ron is writing about earthquakes all the time. I'll never forget when the earthquake happened in Trona back in 2019. You were on a cruise ship, I think, in South Africa, and you still wrote something about it.
Yeah, I was actually in a hotel room, and I actually saw the LA Times news alert. And I'm like, oh, I need to get working on this.
Oh, my God, man. Next up, Rosanna Shah. Your nickname in the newsroom is the Princess of Doom, I think?
I haven't heard that one in a while. I miss the newsroom, definitely.
And how did you earn that nickname?
Yeah, so I've written about a number of natural disasters over the years on basically why California should not have been built the way it's been built. But my current beat focuses on the California coast, which is more than 1,200 miles long. Imagine going from Boston all the way to Georgia. And there are just so many issues, human and natural, to keep track of. And the coast is this fascinating, ever-moving line between land and sea, and we are really just on the edge. I know this sounds obvious, but the ocean is huge. It covers more than 70% of our planet. It makes 50% of our oxygen. It has absorbed like 90% of the heat we've created from emissions, and we're really starting to feel the consequences in this slow creep kind of way. And so with my stories, I'm constantly trying to find ways to help us connect and understand how so many of our actions, past and present, are interconnected with this massive body of water.
And then finally, our newly minted wildfire reporter, Alex Wigglesworth. Welcome to the club, and why fire?
Thank you. I think it's every reporter's dream to cover issues that people really care about. And when half of the state is on fire every summer, people definitely care about wildfires.
Yeah, and it used to be a quarter of the state every fall. And as Alex said, sadly, it's like increasing more and more and more. We're going to get to summer very soon, literally, and we're already experiencing higher than normal temperatures. And this is globally. In March, NOAA announced March was the 8th warmest month on record. This is as long as record's been kept. NOAA is the federal government's National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which tracks climate change. And after this break, we'll dig into the minds of our masters of disasters and how they're preparing for their beats this summer. This episode is about how we mere humans can try to prepare for the uncontrollable. Ron, you're the earthquakes guy, so obviously California icon. And with our history of tremors, you'd think that we'd be prepared and learn from our mistakes after, 100, 200 years of building buildings everywhere. But you've been reporting on developers who are continuing to build on earthquake fault lines. So for the folks in Iowa who don't really get the earthquakes that we do, explain what's a fault line and why shouldn't you build on top of them?
Yeah, so a fault line is basically, if you think about a big crack in the Earth's surface and think about one block of Earth sliding past the other. So eventually, if you think about LA, the western part of LA is going to slide up and be a suburb of San Francisco in a long time from now. And so that's the thing that we're all worried about in California.
Of course, listeners hopefully have heard of the San Andreas Fault, one of the few major faults in the world near densely populated cities. I mean, the movie industry never lets us forget about it.
You need to get out. And I mean now. Because even though this is happening here in California, you will feel it on the East Coast.
That was from the 2015 movie San Andreas, starring The Rock. But Ron, preparing for earthquakes in California is not just about waiting for the big one, right? I know there's this recent conflict in Hollywood, the actual neighborhood itself, involving a fault line.
Yeah, so there's a fault line that's slower moving. It's called the Hollywood Fault. Everyone's been to Hollywood and Vine and in Hollywood, and you see this little slope there, and you see the Capitol Records building. A fault line runs right through that area. And there are these developers out of New York, maybe about 10 or 15 years ago, they said, hey, we want to develop this land and put some skyscrapers on top of it. Eventually, the state geologist came around and said, hey, we should really take a look at what's going on right here because we think there's an active fault line that goes underneath it. And eventually they said, yeah, we've concluded there's an active fault line there. The developers, they've hired some geologists and they said, no, we don't think there's an active earthquake fault there. And so now there's this big fight over whether or not the city should allow skyscrapers to be built on this land.
What do you think is going to happen?
The latest is that the city has said, you know what, we should really try a little bit harder to figure out if there's an earthquake fault under there. So they're working with the state and they've ordered the developer to dig a huge trench and to really try to figure out if a fault really occurs underneath the property.
How long will this trench process take to try to determine, is there a fault down there or is there not?
A number of weeks. By like mid-April, they had dug a pretty impressive looking sized trench. And the idea was to bring in a bunch of geologists to kind of look to see what it is. But now there's also a fight over, whether or not there are enough trenches. So the city has ordered a trench only on the eastern parcel. But there's also a western parcel, and one of the things that a former state geologist, was telling me is that if you don't dig on the western side, you could have a situation where you have a building on top of two sides of the fault. The other kicker is that not only do they want to build these two skyscrapers on there, but they want to build senior housing, 11-story buildings with senior housing on it. So that's something to really keep in mind.
So not only are we building on top of fault lines, we're also continuing to build near the beaches. And Rosanna, you're our resident coastline expert, and you've warned about sea level rises for years. You've reported that by the end of this century, the Pacific Ocean might rise by 9 feet, and yet we continue to build on the coastline. So how is all this building affecting our beaches?
Yeah, and first, not to be dramatic, but I do want to clarify that 9 feet of sea level rise would actually be a lot more than you think. It's a bit counterintuitive, but very generally speaking, scientists have told me that for every 1 foot of sea level rise, the ocean actually moves inland about 300 feet. So just 1 foot of sea rise could mean the shoreline actually moves in more than the length of an entire football field. So think about how wide your favorite beach is in California from the parking lot to the water, and you can quickly see why it doesn't even take 9 feet, which is the high-end projection for 2100, to be a problem for our built environment. So as for our beaches, which is so core to our California identity, there's this big USGS study that gets cited a lot.
That's the United States Geological Survey, the federal agency in charge of studying natural hazards.
Yeah, and they showed that if we continue business as usual, more than 2/3 of our beaches in Southern California alone could be gone by the end of the century. We often think of beaches as, this fixed place that we go to, but the beach in reality is more of a process. Rocks, cliffs, sediment are constantly getting ground up into sand, churning in the ocean, and the ocean is moving the sand from beach to beach with every wave and tide. So when we do something to disrupt this natural flow of sand, whether it's building a dam or lining a river with concrete like the Los Angeles River, or building a seawall which hardens the shoreline into a fixed line that doesn't move with nature, we are slowly destroying all our beaches.
Where are you seeing the most visible signs of these disappearing beaches? Like the ones that I know down here in Orange County, Capistrano Beach, they used to have like basketball courts. I think they had a whole country club down there about 60 years ago. And now everything's all broken up. And you see the pictures before and after. It's completely apocalyptic. Where else are you seeing it?
Yeah, I love that we're talking about disasters in this episode, right? Because the term I hear a lot in my world is slow-moving disaster. You can't stand on the beach for one afternoon and feel like the sea is rising and that this is a disaster we need to confront now. And, we also think in these time frames that don't help us see the big picture. I was really struck by what Ron was saying about the development project in Hollywood. We think about 30-year mortgages. We think in 4-year political terms. We think in the gazillion years it takes to plan a project, do an environmental impact review, and then have everything challenged in the courts, appealed, counter-appealed, and then litigated again. But if you really stop and look, there are a lot of signs that the ocean has been giving us. You named a few in Orange County. I immediately thought of Broad Beach in Malibu. That's a really popular example. It used to be a super broad beach, and now it's pretty narrow.
So the moral of the story, basically, just don't build near the coastline anymore.
That's the million-dollar question, or I guess multi-billion-dollar question, right? There's no easy answer, but I would say so much of the California coast is already built out, whether it's homes, critical infrastructure, Pacific Coast Highway. We built so much of the coast back before we knew better. And the question now is really about, are there places along the coast where we can be smarter about the way we rebuild and redesign into the future so that we're moving inland with the ocean or accommodating the water in some more thoughtful way? Are there places that we can eventually let go of, especially as we start phasing out aging infrastructure or homes that have outlived its time? These are all really tough questions, but we need to confront them.
And you've written about this idea of cities considering something called managed retreat. Can you define it for us?
Managed retreat is basically this idea that, if we are in the way of the ocean, whether it's next year, 10 years from now, 50 years from now, but recognizing the fact that the ocean is moving inland as the sea rises due to all of these other kind of climate change related issues, and also the fact that we are drowning out our beaches from cutting off sediment flow and all these other issues. What does it mean to move inland with this line? Does it mean buying out the first row of homes facing the ocean right now and moving them elsewhere? And again, just think of this tide line as this line that is creeping inland. And what does it mean to move Pacific Coast Highway, homes, critical infrastructure inland as the ocean is moving in? It's basically planning for what the shoreline will look like decades from now, but having kind of this approach baked into the way we plan for the coast so that we don't continue to build things that will get in the way of the ocean eventually and require a lot of money, a lot of planning, a lot of debate to move something out of the way of disaster.
Delayed gratification, in other words, plan for the future instead of the instant, which means it's probably going to fail because here in California, we need it now, now, now. Let's talk about wildfires. Speaking of now, Alex, so last year, on top of coronavirus and the whole pandemic, 2020 set all sorts of disaster records for wildfire damage from Colorado all around the West. There was more than 10 million acres burned, tens of thousands of buildings destroyed, dozens of deaths. Wildfires in California, of course, go back before the Spaniards arrived. They're just part of the landscape. But why was 2020 such a bad year for wildfires?
Sure. So last year was kind of like the perfect storm of conditions that caused fires to spread rapidly. We didn't get much rain or snow, so all the vegetation was dried out. In some forested areas, longer-term drought had also caused trees to die or become vulnerable to fatal bark beetle infestations. So there was this buildup of dry, dead fuel. Then we had back-to-back historic heat waves. It was the hottest August on record in California. We had a tropical storm off the coast of Mexico that sent a huge amount of moisture up the coast. Essentially, the moisture and the heat ran into each other, and the result was these intense lightning storms along the Central Coast and up into Northern California. Those lightning storms sparked hundreds of fires.
But because everything was so hot and dry, they spread super quickly, and some of them merged into these gigantic mega fires. And then a short time later, we had these fierce downslope winds that drove the fires to spread even more. So of the 6 largest wildfires ever recorded in California, 4 were ignited by these lightning storms. It was the largest fire, the 3rd, 5th, and 6th largest. All of that took place last year.
Oy vey. Tell us about some of the things firefighters are doing to prep for the wildfires that no doubt will come this year.
Sure. So CAL FIRE is the firefighting agency for the state of California. So CAL FIRE says this is something that they're always doing year-round. As summertime approaches, one thing they do is ramp up staffing. Last month, the governor announced that emergency funds would be used to hire nearly 1,400 more firefighters, most of them seasonal firefighters. They also like to do what they call fuel reduction projects throughout the state year-round. Those are things like prescribed burns, going in and thinning vegetation with machines or by hands. The idea is to reduce the amount of stuff available to feed a fire, also creating fuel breaks around fire-prone communities. So if there is a fire, it runs out of things to burn before reaching homes. Community engagement is also a big one. CAL FIRE crews go out and educate the public about clearing vegetation from around their homes to create defensible space, which is a buffer between your house and any wildfire that might be burning nearby. They also talk about home hardening, which is when you remove opportunities for embers to seed in and around your house. That's stuff like cleaning rain gutters, moving wood piles away from the side of your house, and putting mesh over vents and other access points where embers may be able to get into. Experts say that a lot of times homes don't catch fire because they're overrun by a tsunami of flames. It's actually an ember from a fire that's miles away that might land on a roof and ignite dry brush. Then your home catches fire, then the home next door. And before you know it, it's the whole block. And that's why home hardening is so important. So there are things that people can do to kind of prepare for a wildfire.
That sounds like the nightmare version of the little feather that starts off Forrest Gump.
Yeah, it's a lot of times it's a little trigger that can start a really big conflagration that can kind of take out a whole neighborhood. So it's important not to be sort of that weak link in development of homes, that, you know, you prepare your space to be as fire resistant as possible.
I know we can't predict wildfire season, but are there any indications of what 2021 is going to happen with wildfires? I know there was a small one, I think. Where was it? Up in like Santa Clarita or somewhere recently?
Sure. Yeah, we've already been seeing some wildfires this year, and it's May. So it is appearing like it could be a severe fire season. There's something called the Swiss cheese model that some risk prediction experts have described to me. And basically what that means is each variable that can contribute to a disaster is like a slice of Swiss cheese, and they layer on top of each other. And most of the time, the holes do not all line up. Like maybe you get lightning, but vegetation is still damp from snow melt, so the fire doesn't spread. Or it might be hot and dry, but nothing happens to ignite a fire. So to get a disaster, which is like a record-setting fire season like we had last year, all the holes in all the layers of the Swiss cheese have to line up.
The Swiss cheese one's interesting because someone also used that same exact metaphor to talk about another disaster, coronavirus, saying that the more preventive measures you have, it is just like Swiss cheese.
Yeah, I liked that one. I thought that was a really interesting way to look at it.
I'm all for a good science metaphor. That's great.
Exactly. That's like, I think this is a thing that they actually teach people who predict risk for a living. And so like what we know now is, yes, we're in a drought. It's expected to stay dry. It'll probably be hot this summer. That makes things even drier. But in order to have a fire, of course, you also need something to ignite it. So that can be lightning or it can be humans. Both are erratic and really hard to predict. So like, will we get certain kinds of storm systems? Will someone fire a gender reveal cannon into a dry hillside? Like that happened last year. If stuff like that happens, we could very well be in, for a fire season that's even more active than the one we saw last year, given how dry things are. But that said, like maybe we get lucky and everyone is really careful and the weather cooperates and things aren't as bad as last year. It's hard to say.
Hot girl summer coming to a California near you. We'll have more after this break. So back to our Masters of Disasters, a question for all of you. What's one thing that people can do to prepare for this summer, and specifically with your beat? So let's start with Rosanna.
Yeah, I think awareness and just learning more about kind of how all these factors interconnected in terms of sea level rise adaptation is really important. I think there's still quite a bit of a disconnect in understanding how one decision here on this beach might impact another beach or another kind of whole domino effect of something else along the coast. And ultimately what's at stake is, can you imagine not having a beach to go to? And that's a real reality for many communities in California as sea level rise continues to move in. And so every coastal city and county up and down the California coast has been developing vulnerability assessments, figuring out their priorities on what they want to protect and what might be possible in terms of letting it go in the coming decades. So I would encourage maybe a first step is to just read up on what your closest city or your favorite beach town is doing about preparing for sea level rise. It's a very long process, but the longer we wait to start making these tough decisions, the more loss is at stake.
Ron, I just bought an earthquake kit at CVS for, I think, $50. What else should I be doing to prepare for any earthquakes?
I'm going to tease you a little bit and say strap down your bookcases.
Yeah.
That would be a kind of a key thing. Strap down bookcases, even consider putting a bungee cord on the books. And then one other thing, download the Earthquake Early Warning app. There are two out there. One's called MyShake, that's from Berkeley, and the other one's called Quake Alert USA. And those will give you alerts of warnings of incoming shaking if an earthquake has occurred a little bit farther away from you. That shaking is on its way.
Alex, how do we prepare for wildfires?
If you own a home in a fire-prone area, there are definitely steps you can take to make it less vulnerable to fire, like we talked about earlier. But if you don't, I think that just being aware that, hey, if you're going to be out hiking or picnicking in some of these wilderness areas, just be careful. Things are really dry. Human activity is often what sparks wildfires, and I think it's important just not to do anything that creates a spark, if possible.
Be prepared. More than anything, be prepared, folks. And we don't want to be all doom and gloom here. So let's go around for each of you. What's sparking your joy and helping you cope right now? Alex, you're new to the disaster game, so you go first.
My dog, Steve.
Steve, what kind of dog? What's so cool about Steve?
I mean, what's cool about him is he's just the best. I don't know what kind of dog he is. I'm not positive how old he is. I think he's a mutt, some kind of terrier mix. But I don't know. We enjoy hiking, camping, spending time together. He's just my buddy.
Steve, you're a badass. Awesome. Rosanna, what about you?
Joy, Gustavo, you're killing me with these questions. I walk a lot. I've been crying a lot, to be honest. It's hard not to with so much pain and sadness this past year. So I joined a virtual nature writing group during the pandemic, and it's been amazing to make new friends during such a weird time. I've never met any of them in real life, but they have helped me flex a different kind of writing muscle, one that's more meditative, more personal, more in tune with so much of the beauty that continues to surround us and is right there if we just slow down and give nature our attention. So yeah, that has been really grounding for me.
Awesome. And lastly but not leastly, Ron, what brings you joy right now?
So in my walks, I try to make sure to get sunshine every day, and I really try to focus on listening to bird song, and that has just brought a ton of joy to me.
Well, what's your favorite bird right now?
I don't know any of the names of the birds. There's a red one and a blue one that I really like in my neighborhood.
Try to make one of the bird songs.
It's like a blue, blue.
I think that's a meadowlark. I don't know.
I was going to say, on a more serious note, in my nature writing group, we were just talking, one person in the writing group was sharing that a philosopher who said that attention is a form of prayer. And I really found that beautiful. And I really love that Ron is paying attention to the birds outside.
Nature's a beautiful thing. Nature could be a very disastrous thing. So that was Rosanna Shah, Ron Lin, and Alex Wigglesworth, our masters of disaster. Gracias all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And that's it for this episode of The Times, daily news from the Los Angeles Times. Our show is produced by Shannon Lin, Stephen A. Cuevas, and Denise Guerra. Our executive producer is Abby Fenter-Swanson. Our engineer is Mario Diaz, Julia Turner is our editor, and our theme music is by Andrew Epen. Tomorrow, I hand off the mic to my colleague Del Quentin Wilbur on how baseball helped a man get through a harrowing hostage journey. I'm Gustavo Arellano. We'll be back tomorrow with all the news in Desmadre. Gracias.